Thank you, Elle, and greetings all. Welcome to today's semi-annual progress reporting webinar, Reporting Victim Services. My name is Julia Bergeron-Smith, and I am here with my colleague, Casey Benner, and we are members of the VAWA Measuring Effectiveness Initiative, the TA provider charged with helping you learn about and complete your OVW progress reports. I want to thank TA2TA for hosting today, as well as thank all of the interpreters and captioners that are on the line as well, supporting us. Before I give you a little more details about the plan for today, I did want to give you some information about how we're hoping to use some of the features of the Zoom webinar room. As Elle mentioned, there is a chat pod and a Q&A pod, and the chat pod will be used to provide you with information. And as Elle had mentioned, the Q&A pod is where you can give us your questions and we will answer those questions. However, our hope is to answer the majority of those verbally at the end of the webinar so that we're able to cover all the important material and then answer your very equally important questions. However, it could be the case that you have a question that's super pertinent to what we're covering, or maybe it's something more specific to your grant program. In that case, Casey, me, or our colleague Hannah, who's also on the line, will give you a written response, probably during the webinar itself. And just a couple of reminders, I did want to remind folks that progress reports are due 30 days after the close of the reporting period. So the progress report due date is July 30th for the January to June 2021 progress report. And finally, I wanted to remind you that this is an overview of the victim services section. So there are 15 to 20 different grant programs that OVW funds, and everybody's section has overlap. There are some pieces that are very specific to programs. And so while this particular webinar is looking kind of at that broad stroke for victim services, housing grantees, transitional housing grantees, there is a separate webinar for you because your victim services section is quite different than everyone else. There's certainly overlap with today's presentation. So if you're here, I encourage you to stick around. But if you have not heard about the transitional housing webinar that's happening, I think in 2 weeks from today, or maybe yesterday, I do encourage you to sign up for that, and I'll ask Hannah to put that in the chat pod for folks to, oh yeah, there it is. So if you want to check that out, you're able to. Okay, with that, a little bit more about who we are. And so we here at VAWA MEI, we are a technical assistance provider. So we are not OVW. We're also not JustGrant, but we do certainly engage, especially OVW, both of those entities. Instead, we are a OVW grantee just like you. We are charged with helping grantees track and measure the work they're doing with VAWA dollars, and we do that through a couple ways. We provide technical assistance, and so that could be emailing with you one-on-one, setting up a phone call, setting up a Zoom call, and then additionally, we offer webinars like this one that are live, and then our website has a slew of other resources, such as recordings that you can watch, the information about your specific grant program, section by section. So we'll show you the website in a little bit. But I do encourage you, if you get a taste of the information you want today, please do go to your grant program, and there's a lot of program-specific information that you can access on the website. And as I mentioned before, we are your TA provider to help you with this, especially as we get closer to July 30th. And so we'll have our contact information up as well, because we love hearing from you, whether that's through our website, directly through email, on the phone. We're here waiting to help, so please do reach out if any questions come up. But today, I'll tell you a little bit about our goals for this particular session. So today we're learning how to report victim and services data for the victim services section of your semi-annual report. It's going to be pretty broad, but it will cover a lot, so thank you for being here. We're also going to test your new or renewed knowledge, and we will do that through some polls that will be pulled up later on as we're going through that information. And then additionally, we're going to also review the available resources and where to ask for help. All right, before we jump into the section itself, I do have a few other slides. The first one is tips for successful data reporting. And so the guidance is always only report on OVW grant-funded activities, services, and staff. These progress reports are really looking to capture what you're doing with the OVW grant dollars that you've received. We recommend that you use the narrative questions to discuss successes, provide more detail, or explain the data that you've included in your report. There are narrative questions throughout the progress report, and then additionally, there is a section of narrative questions at the very end of the report. And we know that the data you report only tells so much of the story, so we do encourage you to use those narrative questions to really speak specifically about the work you're doing. Additionally, we recommend that you access all the resources that I was chatting about before, and that you access our one-on-one technical assistance and other tools we have available for progress reporting. And finally, I put this reminder in a little text box because this is not on the original slides. So if you don't see it on your handout, I just added this a few moments ago. I did want to remind folks that your OVW semi-annual progress report is on our website. And so we'll be going to our website in a little bit. It's not in your JustGrant account. So you don't want to go to JustGrant to find the report. You want to come to our website. OVW did also email folks a couple weeks back, I believe it was, with a link to your progress report, and that would have brought you to our website. However, you will engage the JustGrant account because you do need to upload your progress report as an attachment when you're done filling it out. If you completed a progress report last period, it is the exact same for this period, and the reports themselves are also identical. Okay, so moving on to a little bit of general guidance related to COVID-19. As I mentioned, the due date for the January to June 2021 progress report is currently July 30th. There was an extension given last round, and I'm not saying they're ruling that out this time, but please do complete your reports with that date, July 30th, in mind, because that is in fact the due date. So we do understand, though, that grantees may be hindered in reporting complete and accurate information because of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially if you or your project partners do not have access to files, or maybe data is not being collected in the way it usually is when you're in the office. And so here's some tips to work with that. We do recommend that you do not report estimates. You do want to have adequate source documentation, so meaning records to support any of the data that you're reporting. And then additionally, we encourage you to use the narrative question to discuss missing data, but then also the impact that COVID-19 has had on your grant-funded work. And so, as I mentioned before, those narrative questions are really throughout the progress report, that there is that last section of the progress report that's all narrative. And we encourage you to use words like COVID-19 and pandemic, because those are some of those keywords that we're looking at as we're gathering data to see what challenges or what strategies kind of came up across the field of grantees. And that's helping us in OVW really understand what you're doing, how you're working around all of this, and maybe, you know, what would future programming look like based on this information. A little more general reporting guidance related to this pandemic. We ask that you do not use a future period's progress report to report activities that took place in the January to June 2021 period. As I mentioned before, it could be the case that you don't have data for whatever reason or you couldn't collect it, please, discuss that in the narrative. But if the data does become due, we ask that you contact your OVW program specialist to see how they would like you to report that data. Sometimes it's the case that they'll connect you with us and we'll just make sure that data gets into your report once the files get to us. But please do not use a future period to report stuff you're doing currently, or I guess you just finished doing, because we are now in July. Another tip is that when you validate your progress report at the end, there's this button you click to go through validations to make sure everything's happening or happy. If it's the case that there is a data field that's blank and it needs to stay blank, either because you don't have data for that or you think it's accurate and you're like, what is this doing? We encourage you to enter 1 in any field that is throwing off a validation warning, and then just use the final question at the end of the form to let us know what you did to satisfy the form in order for it to validate. And so, for instance, if you have to enter 1 in question 20, let us know that in the final narrative question, and then we're able to kind of clean that up and make sure your data looks as you want it to. Few more resources. So these are COVID-19 resources that the Office on Violence Against Women, Futures Without Violence, and then TA to TA have available. These aren't specific to progress reporting, but could certainly inform you and give you great resources related to COVID-19 and maybe what other grantees are doing to still get their work done. And so I encourage you to check those out. They are active links if you printed off our materials. Well, I guess if you have it as a PDF on your computer, it's an active link. It won't really click if it's printed. And then these are the VAWA MEI specific COVID-19 resources. And so these are all things available on our website. These are direct links to those files or those offerings. You can also do searches on our website to find these things. But going through these, we have some FAQs related to COVID-19 and reporting. We have our contact us form where you can reach out to us if you have questions, previous reporting related to how to report during a pandemic, and then our crafting narratives webinar video, which gives you a bunch of great examples of how people are using the narrative to talk about what they're doing with their funds and the progress they're making in their communities. So with that, I will now pass it over to my colleague, Casey.
Thank you, Julia. Hi, everybody. My name is Casey. Nice to see how many attendees we have today. As Julia mentioned, we are going to be going over the victim services section, but it's important for anybody who is a transitional housing grantee to note that the transitional housing program reporting form is a little bit special, and that's why we're having a separate webinar for that one, because some of the questions that transitional housing grantees have to respond to do not align with other program reporting, and they're a little more complicated. So please, if you have a transitional housing grant, consider coming to the transitional housing webinar. You can sign up on our website, and feel free to use the Q&A as we move into this section. So for the victim services section, throughout all of the reporting forms, most of the data in those sections is congressionally mandated data that you have to report for the purposes of being a grantee. That's the kind of data that gets collated into reports for Congress, and it really helps highlight the areas of remaining need to your OVW program specialists. And it also gives you an opportunity to talk about great and upcoming different practices that you have going. The really important thing to remember here is we're always talking about grant-funded services. And we're going to be going over in the next couple of slides how to tell who should be reported in this section. Thank you, Julia. Okay. And so another important note for this training is that we're only referencing domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking as the victimizations in our examples and what we'll be saying out loud. But we recognize that there are other grant programs and grantees present today who have programs that address other types of victimizations like elder abuse, child abuse, sex trafficking or exploitation. So we are not forgetting about you grantees or those victimizations. We just wanted to clarify that we're honing in on just a few for the purposes of this report. For this training, sorry. And then we're also going to be referencing only adult victims and survivors throughout, but again, we recognize that some grantees are serving youth and children victims. Okay. One of the most common questions we get from grantees is how do we know who gets reported in this section? And there are these 3 handy dandy bullets to help you figure out if the victim that you're serving, your client, is somebody who should be captured on this reporting form that you're filling out. And those 3 bullets are that you're considering if this victim, client, survivor received, accepted, requested a grant-funded service, and that they are a primary victim of the victimization that your grant covers under the scope of your program grant. So in this bullet, our examples are DV, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, although again, some of you might be serving other victimizations. And then once you've figured out if the client you're thinking about meets all of the criteria to be considered, there's also instances where you're going to find out that they don't meet any of those requirements or they're not quite meeting all of them. And in those cases, we're thinking of victims and survivors who do not get reported on this reporting form. In those cases, perhaps they were only seeking a service that was funded through a different funding stream, so it wasn't supported by your grant funds. Maybe your staff offered this client services and they refused all of them. In that case, the victim chose not to seek or accept any services and they wouldn't be reported. Or you might discover that the person seeking services is actually not a primary victim of one of the victimizations under the scope of your grant. And in that case, they would again not be reported in the victim services section. Alrighty. So now let's say the client you're thinking of did meet the requirements of seeking or accepting a grant-funded service and being of a primary victimization that your grant covers under its umbrella. Then we're going to try to figure out if they should be reported as served, partially served, or as not served. And it's actually not as simple as it sounds, because every time someone is seeking a grant-funded service, you're going to consider the programmatic reasons for whether or not they could receive that service when you come back to deciding served or partially served or not served. And I also want to highlight before I move on that it's not a bad thing to report not served or partially served. OVW is well aware that the grant funds that you all get are limited and they can't meet every single person's needs, unfortunately. There's just never quite enough funding to do everything in the whole world that you want to do at your agency. And that's okay to be reporting on. It's a really important data to highlight things like when you have long waiting lists or when there are barriers to providing services to people who come seeking them. So don't ever be afraid to report your data as partially served or not served. It does not reflect badly on your agency in any way, shape, or form. Okay, so when you're thinking about reporting someone as served, partially served, or not served, it's also very important to remember that you're only reporting a single human one time on each reporting form. So it doesn't matter if they were a client in the previous reporting period. You're starting fresh with the reporting period that you're considering, and it's an unduplicated count regardless of how many times you serve that unique human throughout the entire reporting period. That's what we mean when we say unduplicated count. So if someone comes into your agency seeking services 3 times over the course of the whole reporting period, you're only going to consider them for served, partially served, or not served for once that you will report them in one of those categories. So you won't be reporting a single person in all 3. It's just by the end of the reporting period, were they fully served for all of the services that they requested that were grant funded? Or were they not able to get some of them? Then they would be partially served. Or by the end of the reporting period, they were not able to get any of the grant funded services that they requested. And so then they would be not served. In any case where you're finding that someone was not able to be fully served, so perhaps the hours of operation for your agency didn't meet the client's needs, those are all programmatic reasons that you're considering, as in it's not the client's fault that they couldn't receive the services. It's a programmatic barrier to providing those services. So sometimes there's a conflict of interest that stops you from being able to provide somebody the services that they're requesting. In all of those instances, you're going to be filling out the reasons for partially served and not served. And they're all just check boxes in the victim services section. You'll just check whichever category is the best fit for why your agency or organization wasn't able to provide somebody with the grant funded services that they requested during the reporting period. Some of the forms, not all of them, but some have 1 row of check boxes for partially served, and some have 1 row of check boxes for not served. So in that case, you'll want to be careful to indicate which reason applies to the partially served victims and which reason applies to the not served victims. A lot of forms only have 1 column of check boxes that encompasses anybody you reported as partially served or not served. There is an other category for reasons partially or not served. And oftentimes we see grantees struggling to figure out the best fit for why they're reporting somebody as partially served or as not served. So they use that other category to describe a situation to us. And when we review that data, our analysts pick up on a lot of themes of common misconceptions that signal there was a misunderstanding with how to report partially served or not served. So we've put some of the most frequently viewed or commented types of reasons in these last 4 bullets that are errors and are considered errors for figuring out how to report somebody as partially or not served. So for someone who does not return, or if you're considering writing victim did not return for services, that actually isn't the reason not served, and it might indicate you put them in the wrong category of either partially served or not served. So if your program started providing services to a client, the grant funded services that they accepted or requested, and then they stopped coming back to receive those services, it's for the purposes of the form considered the victim is withdrawing. It might be that they relocated. It might be that they didn't feel safe continuing services. There's tons of reasons why victims don't return. But in that case, for the purposes of this form, you're going to report that they are fully served. They came to all of the sessions or meetings that were grant funded for whichever service it is, as much as they chose to, and then they stopped coming. And that isn't your fault as an agency. It's not a programmatic reason why they're not served. That's the client's choice, and it always comes back to the client's choice. Even when as service providers, we kind of feel a little gross about that when we're reporting, because maybe it's a victim that they didn't have a choice. And so it can feel not great when you're coming back to the reporting form that's kind of asking for something that doesn't really align with maybe your values as a service provider. For any time a victim or client refuses to accept services, again, gets back to that choice part, you would not be reporting them on the form. You're only considering clients who accept anything they've been offered that's grant funded, or that they come and request grant funded services. There's that choice piece. For the third bullet, sometimes we see people write the service wasn't provided by our program. That indicates a misunderstanding for the section. For the victim services section, you're always only considering the services that your agency is grant funded to provide. So if a victim is asking for something that isn't available at your agency and maybe you have to make a referral, it's great that you made the referral and you don't need to report them as not served, because that's not something that was in the scope of your grant to serve. And then the last one is could not locate the victim. This is sort of related to the first bullet. It's really, really unfortunate and upsetting when you know that somebody could be receiving support or services that they've asked for, and then you can't find them anymore. And it doesn't feel good to report them as any of these categories, really, because you know you want to be serving that person. But for the purposes of this form, it kind of goes, again, back to victim choice. If the client wanted you to find them or wanted to receive the services, then it's on them to engage and accept or participate in those services. So if your agency started serving this person services and maybe they came to a few of the, say it was counseling that was grant funded, and they came to a few counseling sessions and then they dropped off your radar and you couldn't locate them anymore, that would be somebody who's fully served. They got all of the services that they showed up and accepted. And then they chose to withdraw or drop off your radar. If somebody called asking about a service, but then never showed up, they're not going to be reported on the form at all because they chose not to accept any services. So again, these 4 bullets kind of capture a lot of the feelings we have as social workers or people in the field who want to be serving victims. And the form isn't geared towards that line of thinking. It's more, did the victim accept these things, request them, or didn't they? Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is go through a handful of examples. So what we'll do is read out a scenario, and there's going to be a multiple choice answer for you to try to get the hang of what it's like to report on the form and figure out if a client is served, partially served, not served, or if they're maybe not even reported on the form at all. Alrighty, so in our first example, we're going to pretend that your agency uses program grant funds for the services of crisis intervention, counseling, and civil legal advocacy. A victim of domestic violence comes to your agency requesting the grant-funded crisis intervention and also transportation. Your agency is able to provide the crisis intervention, but not able to provide the transportation. So if everyone could try to take a guess about how this person would be reported, hopefully you just saw a poll pop up on your screen. And it's okay to guess if you're not sure. It's awesome to see how engaged everyone is. And the key with this question is which services are grant funded and did the client get their grant funded services? Alrighty. So the majority of us got this one right. This person is fully served. And they're fully served, even though they didn't receive the transportation, which is the tricky part. because the transportation is not a grant-funded service. So that's the key. If the services that they're requesting are grant-funded, that's how you consider them for served or partially served. For the purposes of this example, the transportation doesn't count towards if we're counting them as served. So they got their grant-funded crisis intervention, and that was the only grant-funded service they requested, so we report them as fully served. Alrighty, our second example. A survivor of sexual assault comes to your agency requesting counseling at the beginning of the reporting period, and we're assuming actually that this is a grant-funded service. And then that same person comes back at the end of the reporting period and requests legal advocacy. They're both grant-funded services that you are able to provide, and you're able to provide them during the reporting period at the time that this client requests them. So how would we report this client? You see a lot of us are making the right choice on this. Very cool. And so this person is fully served. They're served because they requested 2 of your grant-funded services, and your agency was able to provide both of them at the time they were requested. We're only going to report this person one time as served on the report, even though they came in at 2 different times during the reporting period, because the form is asking you how many unique clients came to you to request grant-funded services. All right. We are going to move on to our third example, and I'm going to hand us off to my colleague, Julia.
Thanks, Casey. All right, so we are moving into example 3, which reads that your OVW program grant-funded program offers counseling and legal advocacy, so very much grant-funded. A victim of stalking requests these 2 grant-funded services, and you are unable to provide either service because your program is filled to capacity. How would you report this survivor? So we have the poll opening up, and we have A, served, B, partially served, C, not served, and D, not reported. This is quite fun watching all your votes come in. Okay, that's a good group of people. So I'm going to move us forward. And we have a 91% correct answer of not served. Apologies if the odd wording of that question got you. So the grant-funded services that were requested, both were not able to be provided by your program, who is grant-funded to provide those services. So this is a full not served example. And then you're also going to check off program reached capacity as the reason the person went unserved. And as you see in that reason, that is related to your program's ability to provide those grant-funded services. Okay, we're rolling into our final example. Example 4 reads, your OVW program grant funds group and counseling services. A survivor of sexual assault comes to your office and requests transportation and legal accompaniment, which you are able to provide through other funding. How would you report the survivor? A, served, B, partially served, C, not served, or D, not reported. This feature makes me want to ask all questions in my life with a poll. This is very exciting. Okay, so this one's a little tricky. The answer is D, not reported. The survivor only requested services that you are not funded with your OVW grant to provide. And so because they're not OVW grant funded services, they're not actually being reported at all, because this progress report is looking at your ability to provide services related to your OVW grant and the services that you are grant funded to provide. Okay. So that ends the whole portion. I think I've closed that out successfully. And we're going to move forward with the victim services section, and now talking about secondary victims. And I do want to note that not all progress reports ask about reporting secondary victims. So please keep that in mind, that it may be not applicable to your program if you're not serving secondary victims or being asked to report about them. Secondary victims are those who are indirectly affected by the violence. So that could include children, siblings, spouses, grandparents, or other affected relatives. For the purposes of this progress report, secondary victims must receive services to be reported. And then additionally, it's important to remember that secondary victims are not reported in the demographics section of the progress report. All of that demographic data that we're about to chat about, that is just for the primary victims and survivors that you're serving. Okay, digging more into the demographics. The demographic data that is collected is race, ethnicity, age, gender, and then also some other demographics. For the race, ethnicity categories, a victim or survivor may be reported in more than one. So if they identify as more than one, you can capture them once under each category they identify with. Therefore, each race or ethnicity option that's listed there will be equal to or greater than the total of victims served and partially served. However, when you get to the age and gender categories, you are only able to report each individual once under one age and one gender. And so therefore, those pieces will be equal to the total of victims served and partially served. Especially now during the pandemic, we know that some of this demographic data gets harder to collect, especially if you're providing a lot of services over the phone and maybe you don't have the same protocols in place. And so we do encourage you to use the unknown option that is throughout the demographics section if you're unable to collect that data. And then just speaking more broadly, OVW would never want you to not be able to serve someone because collecting this data gets in the way of that service. And so, it could be the case that 90 to 100% of your demographic data is unknown for whatever reason. That's okay. Please do use those unknown categories if that's what's most appropriate for how you're reporting your data. And then finally, the demographic question has this other demographic spot. And this is data that you just, you gather as you're providing services. So that could be related to, are folks coming from a rural area? Didn't mean to do that. Are they experiencing homelessness? Like, there's different things that you might learn as you're providing services, and you can include that data here as well. Oftentimes, the other demographics data is less than everything above that. So maybe you only know it for about 50% of folks. That's okay. Provide the data that you do know, and it's more of an opt-in portion of the question. Okay, so that moves us on to the questions related to victim relationship to offender. And so you are going to report a victim survivor's relationship by the type of victimization that they've encountered that they bring when you determine what services you're going to provide them. Unlike the first section of the first questions of the section where everyone's reported only once, here, if a victim has experienced more than one type of victimization, or there has been more than one perpetrator, you are going to report them under each applicable category. It doesn't have to be just the primary victimization. However, we would expect to see at least the amount of individuals reported in, let's say you did 10 individuals, you reported them as experiencing sexual assault, we would expect to see at least 10 under the sexual assault category for this question, but it could be 15, 20, more than that. Oh, I guess that's what the second bullet point was telling me there. The total can be higher under each victimization type. Okay, so you are reporting only the OVW grant-funded services that were provided to victims who were reported as served and partially served during that reporting period. And so when you look at your form and you look at that list of services, you want to start by first thinking about which of these services do I provide with my OVW funds. Once you have that determined, then you want to go to how many victims received that service. And so what this question is asking is that you report one victim for each service they were provided, and that is by service type. So you're reporting one victim who received counseling, and it may be the case that they received counseling 10 times. You're still reporting them once under that question of how many victims received this service. I do want to note there are a couple forms out there where there's a second column that asks you about how many times was that service provided. So again, in that example, if you had someone receive counseling, which you're grant funded to provide, and they received it 10 times, you would count them once in how many victims got this service, and then would report 10 in that second column. But that is only for a few programs, which I realized was on my next slide. So let me bring that up so you can look at that a little bit. We do know that it is the case, especially if you are with the JSF or rural program and this change occurred with reporting, you maybe weren't yet collecting data related to how many total times an individual received a service, and that's okay. So what we would expect to see is that the number in total time served would be at least equal to the total victims who received that service. Meaning, if you do not have the total time data and you have a program that requires that info, if you had 10 folks receive counseling, you would know they received it at least once each, so you could put 10 in there. And then in a future reporting period, if you have that data, we do ask that you include the total time. And as I mentioned, besides those programs, the most of the folks maybe on the webinar, you're not being asked about time the service was provided, just how many individuals received that grant-funded service. Okay, so I'm going to attempt to share something different. Do you happen to see the VAWA MEI website now? Casey, can you see? Cool. Awesome.
Yep, I can see
that. Worked better than I thought it would. Fantastic. So I'm going to show you our website a little bit so you can see where to access your resources. And so here is the homepage of the VAWA MEI website. And we've got a lot of cool stuff highlighted on the front there, but there's a couple ways to get to the information you may be seeking. I always like to go to grant programs. This is kind of my favorite approach. And here you have the list of all of the various programs. You may, have more than one type of OVW grant, so each grant type gets its own little portal. I'm going to go to campus, and then each program page has this sidebar where it shows you your options. There's forms and instructions, training, reporting tools, reports, FAQs, lots of good stuff. You can click on those options and it will bring you right there, but additionally, all of it is available through scrolling down. And just to give you just an example of where to get your report, if you're a campus grantee, the first option listed there is your reporting form. So you click on that. Here is some instructions about how to do the download. Here's a little video about using the form. And when you click this button here, this is letting you view the form within your web browser. But in terms
We lost sound. Okay. Sarah, just for just a moment, please. Julia, we cannot hear you still. Okay, I'm going to pull up the slides that Julia had. She was screen sharing, so bear with me for just a moment. Okay. I go to slides and then present. Okay, so I think I can do this. Let's see. I will screen share this, and then I will open our PowerPoint. I will click current slide. Oh, I typed my name onto these slides, so that's embarrassing. You can all see that now. I'm hoping that you can all hear me, and I see that our interpreters are still going, so I think that you can. Julia was showing us our website. I'm not going to click over to that right now because I'm afraid to mess up the screen sharing at this point. However, if you do visit our website, there are, as she was pointing out, every single grantee program has its own page where you can access the live recording of a training that has a transcript and time markers. So you can switch to any section of the form that you're looking for extra directions. There are the forms and the downloadable instructions on our website, along with instructions for how to safely download those to your computer and access those fillable fields correctly. Because we know a lot of trouble happens when you accidentally start typing into the form when it looks like it's open, but actually the web browser has tricked you into thinking Adobe is working. So make sure to follow those instructions when you're downloading the reporting form very carefully. There are FAQ materials on our website. All of today's resources are on our website. You can contact us from our website if you lose our email addresses anytime. That'll go right to our inbox and it will get fielded to whichever member of our team can best answer your question. And there are reports, lots of fun information and reports that we collaborate on and support OVW with publishing, including the report to Congress. Okay. If you are stuck, there's a few different places that you want to consider going to. So if you need to ask about accessing your JustGrant account, so maybe you can't figure out where to upload your report when it's finished, or you're having difficulties with logging in, you would want to contact JustGrant. We at VAWA MEI cannot help with that. If you're wondering what is allowed under your grant, you will want to reach out to your program specialist at OVW. If you are wanting to create some products, you need to have all products approved by your OVW grant specialist before you use grant funds to create those. If you are going to, for some reason, miss the deadline, and please try not to do that. But if you have to, you want to make sure you reach out to your OVW grant specialist as soon as possible so that they're aware of the situation. Okay. And then here's our contact information, because if you have questions about a question on the reporting form itself, that's where we come in. We are the experts on all of these reporting forms, all of the ins and outs and nuances of the questions on the forms. That's us. So your OVW specialist would likely send you to us if you're asking how to know if someone is reported as fully served or not served. If you're having a validation issue before you upload, you can reach out to us for that too. We know how to do the workarounds when it's a mistaken validation error, because some of the forms do have hiccups that flag things that are not real, unfortunately. So we help a lot of people with validation errors. And you can reach out to us via email or by phone. A lot of us are still working remotely. Most of our team is remote. So we'd probably contact you by email first to confirm what time zone you're in. If you email us and tell us your time zone, and if you want a phone call, that would be helpful too. Now on the screen is my information and Julia's information, our email addresses, and the main VAWA MEI email address and phone number, and the contact us page. And these are all in the downloadable materials for today. Again, you can access those. There's a link to it in the chat pod. And there is a, if you go to our website where you found how to sign up for today, there is the materials on our website as well, including this slide. Okay, I'm going to stop my screen share. And I believe at this point we have, if I can see what time it is, several minutes for answering questions.
Casey, I think you can hear me again.
I can.
Okay, awesome. The lovely TA to TA team got me back on audio and my phone decided to stop working.
Okay.
And I was actually going to hop into some of the Q&A stuff, if that's okay with you. There is just a question about, generally speaking, you know, a lot of awesome Q&A came through that Hannah answered as we were going, and we are being provided with a report on that Q&A. So what we'll do is kind of clean up the question answer, put it in a different document, and then as we get the recordings and transcripts up onto our website, we will include the Q&A and we will send links out so folks know when that's available. It's probably going to be a week, about a week, but you'll hear from us when it's ready. Awesome. So it looks like, Hannah, you have some threads that are going. But I want to see, Casey, do you see anything here that is broad and we may want to verbalize before we close out the webinar?
Yeah, a quick one I see is from Janice about, do we want subrecipients to contact us directly with questions, or do we want them to submit the question through their grant administrator? That's a really good question. And this question is not geared towards discretionary grantees. This is a question for anyone who has a STOP or SASP formula grant, and those are the ones that run on a 12-month calendar year reporting period. So it's a different type of grant in which the sub-grantees have a statewide grant administrator. And this is a great question because we don't have capacity to help the thousands of sub-grantees nationwide. So we ask that grant administrators for the state field questions from their sub-grantees, and if it's something that you're not sure how to answer, then the admin should reach out to us at OVW, at VAWA MEI, and we can help you help your sub-grantee. It will make it much more manageable for our very small team.
Casey, I'm going to share our contact info so people have that as they're answering these last questions.
Alrighty.
There's one question that was answered earlier that I did want to put out to everyone, and it relates to if you get a new client or individual you're serving in the July, they got them in the July to December reporting period, so that was the one before this, and offered some services, provided those, reported them on that report. If you continue serving that individual into then the January to June period, you are going to still report them in that next reporting period. And so you will report a victim survivor in each reporting period you're serving them, but that one time. In this particular example, if you had someone request a service in July to December and you were not able to provide that service until the next reporting period, you would report them as either partially served or not served in that first reporting period if you were only able to provide some or none of those services. But then in January to June, if you provided them the services that they were looking for, even back in that previous one, but you're able to provide that and they're still requesting that in this current reporting period, you would then consider them as fully served. And Hannah typed out a really nice response to that, which we'll include in the document that we'll put up later.
I see another question that I can answer. I'll click answer live because the question from Hope is, I have had perpetrators who approached me and asked for an advocate and advocacy. How would I report these in terms of served or not served? And this comes back to one of the criteria there is when it comes to reporting in the victim services section, that the person needs to be a primary victim of the victimization types that your agency is able to support with grant funding. So in this case, if it's a perpetrator and not a victim, they should not be reported on this form. If it turns out that they are both a victim and a perpetrator, I imagine that to be a more complicated situation, and I would suggest perhaps reaching out to us one-on-one to discuss. Yeah.
Okay, and one other one I'm seeing here that I think is pretty broad and I want to answer for folks here. Just so you know, we have 2 minutes, but we'll get all these questions and get these out to you with answers. But this one was speaking to a previous slide where, you know, some of those incorrect other reasons why you didn't serve a victim or was partially served, didn't return, victim refused services, services not provided by your program. If you see those things coming up, we ask that you reach out to us because it can be very individualized based on your program, why you would be wanting to report those others. And so I'd love to give you kind of like a broad answer, but it really can come down to your approach and what you're doing. So if you're going to use the other category, please do reach out to us and we'll chat with you to talk about that. Okay, so we have about 5 questions unanswered, or 4 questions. We'll look at those, and when we get these answered and in a pretty little format, we'll get it up on the website and let you know when it's available. But thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you all being super interested in learning about your progress reporting, and we look forward to getting to chat with you or email with you. And have a really great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.